So, if you permit, I will begin for a 40-minute talk about gambling, and well, the question should be rather how unfair gambling is. As an introduction, as a matter of introduction, I would like to say that first that I'm not a gambler, in fact. And for me, gambling is a case study of denial. Not that I deny that I'm a gambler, but simply that gamblers in general deny some basic facts about gambling. I've been doing since some time an inquiry about gambling, and in fact, the slides are more or less the content of a book I'm writing at the moment. That's why there are too many slides for 40-minute talks, but I will put the emphasis on maybe that the slides that look more interesting for me in your perspective. So during that inquiry, I've been struck by the fact that most gamblers I met told me, okay, I do gamble, and so I do lose some bets, but on average, I win approximately the same amount as I bet. And this is quite strange because, in fact, gamblers lose billions to gambling operators. For instance, they lose more than 8 billion euros in France, more than 12 billion euros in Italy, etc. So there must be a sucker who loses all that money, while all the normal players, they never lose. They win the same approximately amount as they do bet. Of course, there's no such sucker, and in fact, most gamblers deny the elementary fact about their gambling practice, which is that they lose, and they cannot confess that they lose because what they do lose is, the money of their household, the money of their relatives, etc. So they cannot confess they do lose. So there's denial in the small, and there's also denial in the large, because if you look at the macro level, you see that most countries restrict or prohibit either gambling or, most widely, operating gambling schemes. It's prohibited in many countries, but no jurisdiction, to my best knowledge, no jurisdiction sues anyone for gambling outside the borders of the country. While, when there is a serious crime or a serious offense, most countries do prosecute their own national when they commit a crime outside. For instance, for sexual offense, for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, criminals can be sued even outside of the country. But this doesn't happen for gambling, which means that although gambling can be completely forbidden in a country, people can gamble using internet, for instance. Which means that basically gambling happens in cracks and loopholes of regulation. And this is another sort of denial, which is that basically the country, the government says it's forbidden, but as a matter of fact, people can't gamble. So the usual response from government is that, gambling is anecdotal, because when you look at the statistics, it seems that the gross gambling yield or the gross gaming yield, which is basically the gross revenue of the gambling operators, not the bets in itself, but the part of the bets which is kept by the gambling operators once they have paid the wins to the winners. So the gross gaming yield is only 0.5% of the world GDP. So it seems that gambling is a tiny thing, and so trifling that we don't have to really care about. Of course, the statistics are not very reliable, but in the end, it seems that gambling is 0.5% of the world GDP, growing at the same rate as the world GDP, so nothing to care about. When we look now not at the gross gaming yield, but at the bets themselves, then look, the bets are far more than the gross gaming yield, because in fact the gambling operators, they kept 15 years ago, almost 35% of the bets, hence the payout rate was 65%. And with the competition arising from internet gambling, the payout rate has been growing steadily, and now the bets are far more than they were 15 years ago. And although the statistics are unreliable, the bets are somewhere between $2 and $3 trillion every year. That is between $2,000 and $3,000 billion every year. So although that is not that is still not large. It's between 3 and 4% of the world GDP. And the money which is spent in bet is money that could also be spent in corrupting political decision makers, or money coming from criminal activity that is being laundered through gambling, etc. So I think this is a real matter of concern, because we're not just talking about 1.5% of the world GDP, je vous en prie. We're not just talking about 1.5% of the world GDP, we're talking about maybe 3 or 4% of the world GDP, growing at 10% per year, so it's a matter of concern. A matter of concern, but when we look at where gambling happens, it seems that gambling happens almost everywhere, even when gambling is prohibited, okay? There have been worldwide inquiry by anthropologists that have demonstrated that people appear to gamble for money in many places of the world. And in fact, if we look at places where people do not gamble, then the only communities where gambling do not exist have neither towns, nor writing, nor money. So basically, when people do not gamble, there's no civilization. Okay, there is only primitive life. I'm not talking here about condemnation of gambling. I'm talking about places where gambling do happen, even when it's prohibited. So, in fact, the only places where gambling do not happen at all are places where gambling do not exist because civilization do not exist. And I'm not telling this just to say that gambling is a natural fact of civilization. I'm just saying that, in fact, gambling is really pervasive, and gambling happens almost everywhere. So it might be a matter of concern, especially since it's prohibited, or at least in the Quran, there is a verse which strongly advises the believers not to gamble. So I'm not sure about the right translation nor about the right text. So I kindly ask you to advise me about the right way to quote the Quran. But in the many translations I found, there's the verse 90 of the Surah 5, which says clearly, O you who believe, intoxicants, gambling, idolatry, and divination are abominations of Satan's doing. Avoid them so that you may prosper. And gambling is closely related to divination because, of course, one of the problems with gambling is that the tools for gambling might also be used for divination. Okay, tools such as dices or whatever gambling apparatus, they might also be used for divination, which is a distinct but related problem. Okay, superstition in general. So there is a strong religious condemnation of gambling in Islam, and there are also moral condemnations of gambling. For instance, there is no clear-cut condemnation of gambling in the Bible, but some religious thinkers, either in Judaism or in Christianity, have condemned gambling, well, for various reasons, but the stronger reason are moral reason, which is that an economist would say there are negative externalities to excessive gambling. Okay, moderate gambling can be tolerated, but excessive gambling has strong side effects, which is that people which are obsessed with gambling, they are no longer able to work, they rob their own family to bet, etc. So the figure of the excessive gambler, of course, has been described, at least in the Western literature, which I know. For instance, in Dostoevsky's The Gambler, etc. Okay, so plus now it appears that gambling is connected with organized crime for money laundering, or more recently, since betting on sport has become a more widespread phenomenon, there are many instances of match fixing. Okay, the football matches have been fixed by criminals who bribed players or referees in order to cheat, so that the team which was expected not to win, the so-called underdog, with a better odds with the bookmaker, wins against the favorite, which had lower odds, and so the criminal organization which bribed the players or the referee could make huge profits by betting on the match which has been fixed. So both for private and public reasons, there are many reasons not to prohibit gambling, but at least to have a serious concern about gambling. Okay? But, you know, there's a cycle about gambling which can be observed, or which has been observed during the last 200 years, which is that at some point it is well perceived that gambling is bad. Hence, politicians are elected to terminate gambling. And that was the case in France in the 1830s, or in the US at the end of the 19th century. There has been a crackdown on gambling, and almost at the same time a crackdown on alcohol. So in the end, both gambling and alcohol were prohibited. But then, you know, at some point the state needs money. And it could be a nice idea to authorize gambling in order to take a tax from gamblers so you can fund the state. So more or less corrupt politicians, at some point they do authorize gambling. In France, there was a controversial decision in the 1980s to authorize more casinos and more casinos. It seems that many mayors of local community have authorized such casinos in exchange for money. And in the US, authorization of gambling came in the middle of the 1960s, where lotteries have been authorized, and then many other sort of gambling. So at some point, the politicians think they are clever by, you know, taking money from gambling, because the Roman Emperor Vespasian was he has been famous for having, you know, enabled a tax on urines, on human urine, which was used in woolworking to wash the wool from the sheep. And when he has been criticized by people saying that it seems unlawful and foul to take money from urine, he answered pecunia non olet, which means money doesn't smell. So we don't bother where the money comes from. And now we can say that internet optime reddit, which means in Latin that, you know, taking money from internet gambling has an optimal return. So Vespasian thought he was clever by doing so. But, you know, the point is that gambling in the end brings crime, rising crime, and then at some point the citizens think that gambling is bad, so it should be forbidden, etc. So we enter into a cycle, okay? And at some point, more conservative politicians come in and say, where's the police? And they want to forbid gambling. So my question now is, maybe we can do better than just cycling through highs and lows, cycling through allowing gambling in order to take money and then prohibiting gambling because it brings crime. Maybe we can have a more comprehensive view at the question so that we can take a wiser decision. So what I'm concerned with right now is a political economy of gambling, where I would like to ask, what is gambling precisely? What regulatory options do we have? Who are the stakeholders? What's the traditional economic analysis? And whether there is another way to think of the economic analysis. Okay? And in the end, we'll know who the winner is. I hope we will win. I hope at least you will win from listening to my speech. But it's a gamble you're doing right now by, you know, losing at least 1 hour of your time listening to me. So I thank you for this. You know, I thank you for listening to me. I think it's not entirely a gamble, since I have worked hard to tell you about this. So what are we talking about? Of course, gambling from the gambler side is, you know, placing a stake, which means expending some money in order to get either a win or nothing. Okay. And now when we look at the gambling operator, he gets the money in order to either lose the money to the winner, to the winning gambler, or to be clear with the gambler when the gambler loses and keep the money. Okay. But maybe we can also find that other social activity have the same form as either gambling or taking gambles. Okay. Because if we think, for instance, of an illegal employer in France, what we call le travail au noir, okay, black work. In fact, the illegal employer is the employer who doesn't want to pay the tax on hiring. Because in France, when you do hire someone, you pay a tax, and the tax is used to fund a social insurance scheme, which will be useful to pay when the worker has a work accident. Okay, so if you do not pay the tax on hiring, then of course you keep the money. So it's as if you had got some money. But if it happens that the worker has an accident while working for you, the worker will sue you, and you will have to pay for healing the worker, plus you will have to pay a fine. So it's a kind of gamble, which is that you keep the money, but you can lose much or be satisfied with this, okay? In case the worker doesn't get injured. But now when we look at what happened for the society, the point is that the society, we can think that the society, in fact, somewhat has made a bet because you didn't pay the tax, so the society has lost some money, but on the other side, the society has not to pay in case the worker is injured. So this might not paying the tax on hiring might look like taking a gamble from the society. But the point is that, of course, in many cases, the illegal employer is not rich enough to pay to heal the injured worker. So in the end, what happens is that the society loses the tax and loses the expenses to cure the injured employer. So the society is just robbed, okay? So it's not just, in fact, not paying the tax on hiring is not just gambling, or is not taking a gamble from the society, is in fact purely robbing the society. So gambling is another form of denial, which is basically when we have some compensation schemes which are funded by a tax, and basically this is the welfare state, what we call the welfare state. So when the tax is forfeited, the compensation cannot be paid. So this framing of, compensation schemes such as welfare expenses from the state, this framing leads to a wholly new presentation of liability insurance. By wholly new, I mean that commonly we think that liability insurance is that you pay a premium, and when your civil liability is not involved because you don't have any accident, no problem, then you get no money. But once you get an accident, then the insurance company pays for you. So it's just as if you got money from the insurance company, okay? And so the insurance company on the other side is more or less like a gambling operator, which is taking a stake from you, and in case you get the accident, the insurance company pays as if you had won to the lottery. But the lottery is, for instance, you drive a car, you have an accident, and there is no point for you in paying because the insurance company pays in your place, okay? And so it might seem that an insurance contract is more or less like a lottery ticket, okay? So the usual framing, in Islamic finance of liability insurance is more or less like a lottery ticket. But my point here is that when you forfeit the liability insurance when it is compulsory, exactly as with the tax, the tax on hiring, then what happens is that the society will be left with paying the involvement of your own civil liability, okay? So not paying your liability insurance is just like, from the side of the one who doesn't pay, it's just like gambling plus robbing the society as a whole, okay? So I know this might be provocative, but the point I want to make here is that when you look at the insurance point of view, when you strictly apply either the insurance principle in common law in British Isle, or in civil law in France, what we call the principe indemnitaire, when you cannot benefit from the insurance, what happens simply is that you don't take a gamble as an insured. You pay a tax, and with that tax, the society will be paid back in case you do have an accident, in case there is a problem. So maybe, in fact, insurance is not about gambling, but insurance is just about compensating at the level of the society for the losses that would be left to the society in case people are not able to pay for those losses. Then the other question is, how do you organize the way the society pays for the victims, okay, of problems? And of course, the way this is organized might be either, well, might be different in an Islamic country or in an Islamic framework and in a non-Islamic framework. But, you know, for the beginning, I wanted to show that gamble exists even when we think that there's no gamble. Because basically, the guy who doesn't pay for a compulsory insurance, or the guy in a Western country where, you know, there are some tax schemes which enable compensation where there's a problem or an accident, the guy who doesn't pay, he's more or less a gambler plus a robber, okay? But no, when we look at what we call usually gambling, which is basically paying for placing a stake in order to get a win, there are 4 different regulatory options. The most strange, seen from a modern point of view, is the Roman option, which is exception. In the Roman law, and this feature stayed in the French Code Civil, in the Roman law, in fact, gambling is allowed, but the gambling contract is considered as void, which means that the law does not allow suit for gaming debts, nor for the payment of a wager. That is to say that gambling is out of the law. Not that it is forbidden, but, you know, the state doesn't care. There is another option, which is prohibiting gambling. Then gambling can be regulated, or it can be free, even under license, but it's still free. So my first point will be to explain what exception means. Okay, basically, no legal action for contract enforcement. This sounds strange, but it means that there cannot be, you cannot make a business out of betting, because of course you cannot enforce the contract. You cannot make a business except if you're linked with criminal organization that will enforce the contract. So basically, gambling in Rome, in ancient Rome, was connected with criminal organization. And this is still what happens when gambling is clandestine, for instance. Okay. Okay. This kind of regulation leads, of course, to a maximum prevalence of gambling, because gambling is completely authorized, so anybody can gamble. And of course, there is no tax return because the state does not recognize what happened and doesn't care. That's why we can say that the Romans were pragmatic. So, in fact, as we have seen, Vespasian, he took money from urines. So why not taking money from gambling? And in fact, I'm wondering why the Romans, they were satisfied with these regulatory options, which seems for me very strange. And my idea is that, in fact, the Romans, they knew that it wasn't possible to enforce prohibition. So this would have lowered the credibility of the state policy. So in the end, the state decided to say, we don't care, because they couldn't really prohibit gambling. But, I mean, this is not satisfactory from a contemporary point of view, because either we do agree or we don't, but if we don't, we must enforce the prohibition. So that's the next point, okay? So whatever the prohibition, the problem is that, in fact, prohibition is a regime which is difficult to maintain, because, of course, when you prohibit, there will be undercover clandestine gambling, and it's costly to eradicate that kind of gambling. Plus, now there is online gambling, so people can gamble from their home, and it's very difficult to fight online gambling, since they could use advanced technologies such as VPN or dark web or whatever to gamble. And even if you block some of the possibility to gamble online, they can at least gamble abroad when traveling. So for this reason, it's an unstable regime, plus there is some spillover effect, which is that basically, if you prohibit gambling at home, your own nation can gambling abroad. So it will spread gambling. And plus, there is a cost for eradicating gambling, and as you have no tax revenue to fund that cost, you must take the money somewhere else. So you must have some money available to fight gambling when you prohibit gambling. So maybe it can happen that some forms of gambling are more costly than others. For instance, duels between people who do not agree that were common in ancient France. You know, when two people did not agree, they fought together in duel, and the one who was surviving was said to be the right one. So this is a kind of gambling, because you gamble your life, okay? And of course it's awfully costly, because as someone might lose his life in this kind of duel, a loss of a life is, of course, a huge loss of welfare in an economy. We can also think that financial derivatives were some sort of gambles, okay, and the subprime crisis is a result of excessive gambling. And Ponzi schemes can be some other sort of gambling, etc. So at what point we might find that there might be gambling between sorts of gambling, and for this reason we might want to prohibit only some sort of gambling by some other sorts of gambling, in which case we would be more into a regulatory approach, which is regulating the most extreme forms of gambling and finding some revenue on tolerated forms of gambling, because these tolerated forms of gambling could help fund the fight against intolerable forms of gambling. Okay. So this is basically a map of the world where online gambling regimes are appear. Okay, and it appears that most countries in the world, they prohibit online gambling, but it doesn't mean that they prohibit people from gambling online. It means generally that they prohibit gambling operators from offering online gambling, okay? Which means basically that most countries do not show their own national where they do gamble online. Which means that at some point, every country more or less regulates, which means that the prohibition is only partial, okay? So when you do regulate, it brings you tax resources which can be spent to guarantee public order, to guarantee public health, if you think of excessive gambling as a health disorder, to also protect the consumer, if you think of gambling as a business, a service that is consumed. So basically, regulation allows tax, and the tax can fund the gambling-related policy. But there's an obvious problem there, which is that gambling also makes money, and money makes corruption possible, and there might be also, hence there might be conflicts of objective between the gambling-related policy and the objectives of the gambling operators or the criminal organization, which like more and more gambling because, of course, it's more and more money for them. So for this reason, many countries, well, not many countries, but especially Great Britain thought that it is in fact useless to try to regulate gambling, because basically when you try to take a tax, then there are distortion in competition, and then in fact there will be corruption issues, etc. So we are better off when we let gambling operators freely offer gambles, and all we have to do is simply to view gambling as a normal business and regulate gambling as any normal business, to be sure that there is no scams, no problem for the consumers, etc. This is what the Brits tried to do since 2005, and I must confess this was not completely honest, because their idea were at that point that they were trying to open the continental European markets to their own betting operators, and their view was that if they were allowing complete freedom, all betting operators will be relocating to Britain, so they would benefit from indirect revenue, not tax revenue, but gambling operators having people hired in Great Britain, so that would mean indirect benefits for the British economy, exactly in the same manner as having a low-regulated financial system would bring many financial operators to the City of London. So basically, the case with the British was simply, about regulatory arbitrage. We have the lowest regulation, so guys, come to us, and you'll enjoy a low-regulated environment, so you can freely employ people in the gambling industry. So far for the regulatory options, I would just like to make my point now, which is that the problem is that with internet, for instance, right now it is very difficult for countries to enforce either the regulation or prohibition, simply because their own national can bet or can gamble on internet. So both those who prohibit and those who try to regulate and to take a tax on gambling are annoyed by the development of gambling on internet. Now, if we look at the economic analysis of this matter, most economists think that gambling is an economic activity as any other activity, with consumers, which are gamblers, and producers, which are gambling operators, and then the state or the government is providing regulation and maybe getting taxes, but it's a market as any other market, okay, which can be then described with the common curves of supply and demand, okay. Maybe at this point it is not entirely clear what the price of gambling is, okay, but with very simple math, we can call the price of a game how much you need to bet in order to buy 1 euro or 1 money unit of expected gain, okay. That is to say, the price of the game is the inverse quantity as the payout rate, okay, and payout rate, remember, is how much you get on average by betting 1 euro, okay, or 1 money unit. Of course, we can also take into a consideration the opportunity cost, okay. For instance, if you have to walk down to the racetrack to bet, then there is a leather shoe cost which do not exist if you can bet from your computer. So apart from the price which is taken by the betting operator, there is some opportunity cost. But we see what the price or the cost of gambling is. Basically, it's the inverse quantity of the mathematical expectation plus some opportunity cost. And of course, what the regulation can do is raise the opportunity cost. Okay. By raise the opportunity cost, I mean assume that there is no internet, so you can bet only at the racetrack. Then, of course, some people who are not completely passionate with gambling, they will not go to the racetrack to gamble. So if you restrict the supply of gambling, then less people will play, because it will be exactly as if the price had been raised. Okay. Now you can think of the prohibition simply as a price rise, because when you do prohibit gambling, what happens is that people will gamble in clandestine places, so there will be a higher prices, not just because they must find the places and take some precautions, but also because if they are caught and spend some time into prison, this will be, of course, a large opportunity cost for them. So as long as they are not caught, it's only an expected cost. But this expected cost must be taken into account, and most normal citizens will not afford the price of being at risk of being caught. But basically, some will still take that cost. Hence, prohibition can be understood as a stronger form of regulation. Okay. So now, what the economic analysis says is that basically, permitting consumers access to cheaper supply, of gambling, would have definite benefits. And I'm not writing this. I'm quoting an economist which is specialized in these gambling matters, and which basically says, the guy says that, countries must dismantle their prohibitions or regulation, because the cheaper the access to gambling, the more welfare there is, because, as you have seen, of course, I'm sorry, I'm shifting the slides quite rapidly, but I want to be back to this slide. To this slide, of course. Okay, you see there, the green triangle is what the economists call the consumer surplus, and of course, the more the gamblers can gamble, the more consumer surplus they get, and hence the more welfare in the society. So that's the basic point with the economists. And there have been some welfare analysis in many countries showing that there is a net benefit to gambling because there is a consumer surplus from gambling. And of course, there are some costs. Not just the cost of betting, there are some external costs, but there is a consumer surplus which benefits all the gamblers. Now, when we look at the social cost, we can think of money laundering, we can think of match fixing, We can think of problem gambling, and with all the consequences, in workforce loss, family problems, etc. A very contemporary look at this problem gambling is, for instance, all the young adults which are playing online poker or which are playing video games for money because they think they will become professional of World of Warcraft or whatever. And in fact, they won't ever become professionals in this gambling schemes. But they lose a part of their youth. They lose the opportunity to get a good education. They lose much time in this gambling habits, and of course this is bad for them. So in the end, we can think of the moral decay, and it is illustrated, for instance, by Manon Lescaut, by the Stravinsky's Rake Progress, whatever. So there are many cultural examples of the social cost of gambling. So I don't insist on this. I'm just insisting on the idea that what the economists say is that basically gambling will make your people happy, and of course it will bring you some tax revenue. This is, in fact, this is only an argument to try to open, the continental European market to British or to unregulated operators, which will benefit from new markets. And of course, this is purely rhetorical. It is not what happens. There are social costs, and these social costs must be taken into account. Before I conclude, I would like to say that, in fact, this conclusion, which is the usual conclusion of the economists, which is basically that more gambling is better for the welfare, this conclusion can be opposed if we look somewhat differently at gambling. So I'm passing all this, which are details. I would like to look not at the regulatory problem, but at the economic problem in itself. In fact, it happens that some players have negative price elasticities and some don't. For instance, many players react not to the payout rate, which means not to the mathematical expectation of their bet, but they react to advertising, which means basically that they are not rational. Okay. Plus, there is another stylist fact, which is that now there are some betting schemes, some gambling schemes, where you can act exactly as a betting operator. For instance, on Betfair, which is a so-called betting exchange, you can act yourself as a betting operator, which means you can take bets. So there are no such things as producers of gambling service on the one hand and consumers of gambling service on the other hand. There are no things as gamblers and gambling operators. There are only gamblers, okay? There are winning gamblers and losing gamblers. And most gambling operators are winning gamblers because they still operate and they don't lose money. But there are also other gamblers which can make a living from cleverly gambling or from, as I told you, cheating or fixing matches and then taking bets or placing bets on the fixed matches, etc. So there are no such things as, on the one hand, consumers which do have a consumer surplus and producers of a service, of an entertainment service, because of course gambling is part of the entertainment sector. If we look at the national accounting nomenclature, they are only gamblers, and most gamblers are losing, and those losers, in fact, are those who suffer from home bias, who take time to perceive the difference between the probability distribution of gains between the free demo, which is offered for free online, and then the real gamble when you pay with real money. Because, of course, the demo is only a way to cheat the people who are too naive to understand that once they pay, it's not the same gamble, of course, and they will lose the money for true. And then people who are sensitive to advertisement, those are losers, of course, etc. So all those are subject to a cognitive bias, which has been analyzed by decision theorists, which has been analyzed by statisticians, which has been analyzed by cognitive scientists, etc. All those losers, and which usually rely on magical rituals such as having, a rabbit's foot and petting the rabbit's foot before gambling, etc. All those, they are losing to big gamblers who are the winners. Of course, those don't use drugs win on average can make a living on winning against losers, but they need the losers, okay? Simply because if there are no losers, there are no winners. So the point here is that, of course, you can think of the problem as if you deter the losers enough from gambling, then there's no room for the winners. But the point is that you must be clever in deterring the losers, because you can not just forbid, you must also educate. Okay, so this is the mathematical formalizing of the mathematical modeling, or the try at mathematical modeling of this framing of gambling, not as an asymmetrical relation between gamblers on the one hand, or between consumers and producers of gambling services, but as gamblers overall, some being unskilled gamblers that lose, and some being skilled gamblers that win. I'm skipping all this and go to the practical consequences. The practical consequences is that for players, of course, most gambles are skill games that deserve an investment. Okay, and for the economist or citizen which vote about gambling regulation, basically the welfare analysis which is done by economists is wrong. It's simply cheated, because it does as if people were having rational capacities, and in fact most gamblers are losers because they don't have the cognitive ability, the cognitive skill to gamble rationally. Okay, so the practical consequences from the point of view of regulation and prohibition is, of course, that the first thing that must be done is educate people about gambling, not to allow them to gamble, but to show them that the gambling operators, the winners, they do exist only because some are fool enough to gamble while they will lose. Okay, so the basic is the best deterrent is to educate people and to show them that they will lose. And if people are supplying them with gambles schemes, it's only because they will take profit of them. Okay, then of course you must fight the gambles, beginning by the gambles with the higher social risk. Then, of course, we must fight the economic view, that is that welfare indicators are that, when people gamble, then they are happy. This is not true, okay? Maybe there are some legitimate forms of gambling, some legitimate gambling surplus, some legitimate consumer surplus, but this is not all gambling, because most gambling is done by money launderers, criminals, match fixers, etc. So this cannot be counted as legitimate welfare surplus, okay? And then the question whether gambling is legitimate or not is another one. But most so-called consumer surplus, which is computed by economists, is in fact a count of money laundering and other criminal activity. So we cannot accept welfare indicators as true indicators. Then, if you want to legalize part of the gambling, of course, in case the demand is non-elastic, then you can tax on the point of consumption, the best being a withholding tax, which might fund, for instance, the fight against illegal gambling. Now, if demand is elastic, for instance, when there is an online competition, what you must do is disincentivize opportunistic players by taxing gains, not consumption. And then, of course, this is strictly European oriented, but of course, if you want to go into competition with Asian operators or non-competitive jurisdiction, then you must rely the fiscal pressure and hence tax gains. Okay, but my main point here is that basically the economic view on gambling is completely skewed, because most economists have been paid by gambling operators as consultants to advertise gambling and to present gambling in a socially acceptable way, while basically, as we have seen, basically gambling is people who are skilled, they are robbing people who are less skilled by saying that they are offering, some gain prospect, and in most cases there are no gain prospect. There is a sure gain for the skilled people and a sure loss for the unskilled people. Thank you for your attention, and now I hope you're not unsatisfied about the time you bet on my speech. Do I deserve questions?
We have.
Yes, Sylvia.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions?
Yes, I have actually a question and a comment. I really think that your lecture actually gives a lot of food for thought, and in particular, I would like you to comment more on that aspect of gambling which makes things which we would not otherwise would consider gambling, nevertheless as equivalent to gambling. And you mentioned the whole aspect of insurance, and because one of the main aspects of gambling is obviously uncertainty, and insurance to a great extent has that aspect inherent to it, and but also therefore I'm thinking of long-term investment. At the end of the day, nobody can read the future, and any long-term investment, even wealth investment, has an element of uncertainty. And therefore, my question, if anything, is whether you think that the aspect of gambling that, let's say, people object to has more to do with consequences, an intention to start with, as opposed to with the aspect of uncertainty itself.
Yeah. I also, since we have a round of questions, Pierre-Charles, I really enjoyed, and I really think it's a very, very interesting and thinkable presentation that I think I congratulate you for that, and I will be very looking forward to read your book, beginning with. My questions, I know the presentation was more on the macro level, but since one of the conclusions is on education and educating the weakest part of society, I wonder whether in your book or in your research you came across to the question, psychological question of what it makes people gambling. As you say, it's a denial story. So if it is very clear that it's denial and it's so difficult to win, how people keep on denying themselves on the possibility. I don't know if there is any psychological studies or anything you came across.
Did I get your question right? The first question was whether gambling is more connected with uncertainty, or such as in an investment, or because an investment is uncertain, or whether we think gambling should be distinguished from an investment because the consequence of gambling is not the same as the consequence of an investment. I think the first thing with gambling is that it's a zero-sum game. Okay, it's a zero-sum game, hence, and that's the main difference with an investment. An investment is done with the perspective of producing some wealth, and hence it's not a zero-sum game. It's a positive-sum game. Hence, in the case of work, for instance, or any investment in general, of course, you're trying to enrich yourself, and hence you're trying to create new wealth for the society. Now, if we look at insurance, the difference basically, to think of the difference, you must rely on psychology. So it's part of the answer to Celia. If you look at psychology, of course, a loss is worse than a gain of the same amount. Okay? I don't care about having another, well, it's not the same, losing a house, it's not the same as having a second house. Okay? I'm better off not losing my house than having a second house. So what insurance is offering is the way not to lose your house. What gambling is offering is the way to have a second house. So from a psychological perspective, insurance has a larger utility than betting, than gambling. And so if you accept the usual modeling of decision under risk in economic theory, which is, concave utility function, then insurance has a positive value, while gambling has a negative value. So this leads us, of course, to Sylvia's question: why do people gamble? If you agree to the usual classical economic representation of decision under uncertainty, why do people gamble? Because if people are risk averse, and hence they better off by protecting against risk, they should not gamble. This is a non-controversy in economic analysis. Okay, so there has been a lot of controversy between Maurice Allais and Milton Friedman, especially, and the answer of Milton Friedman was just a trick. Okay, Milton Friedman answered that the utility function of the usual household is first concave, then convex, then concave. That does explain why people buy lottery tickets and insure against losses. I think this is quite. This is a trick, and this does not explain really the thing. Okay, the real thing is that at some point, people who have no way to escape their everyday life, which is quite difficult for them, they see no way to get out of their from a difficult life. And a lottery, for instance, is a way for them to think of a better life. And so when they buy a lottery ticket, they don't gamble. They buy some dream. So in this respect, you can say that gambling is a service. It's also, well, it's not entirely a theft, because some people, win from the lottery. So this might be a way to say that reasonable gambling on both sides might be authorized, because many poor people, they accept to pay a penny every week to get the dream to become rich. And in fact, they are quite comfortable with the idea that, okay, maybe they won't win, but some of them will win. That's why I'm saying it's fair from both sides, not just because the people who bet, they think it's fair, but also because the people who operate the scheme, they do this on a fair basis. And for this reason, in many European countries, lottery schemes are operated by a charity organization. I think it's the case in Portugal, in England, in France. I don't know whether it's still the case in Spain, but it was the case in Spain during the modern era, etc. So I don't think it's difficult I don't think it's possible to educate people to avoid this scheme, because if they think it's fair, it's fair. But I think the real problem is when people are seduced by a cheater who convinced them that they could make big money quickly and surely. Okay, and in this respect, gambling is not very different from investment, because most investment scams, such as Ponzi schemes, if you think of Madoff, for instance, Madoff, he sold his investment product, which were no investment product. Of course, it was a Ponzi scheme, but it sold his investment product by saying, "I have a riskless investment that will make you rich because it pays out 30%." So it sounds like any scam, just like I will teach you poker and you will win big. Of course, you have to lose a bit with me, but in the end, you will end up richer. Of course, the guy, he takes your money and then he disappears. So the basic scam is not in the lottery scheme. The basic scam is in the idea that you can get rich quickly. And there, gambling and investment are connected. If you think of investment as gambling, as the way to get rich too quickly. Am I right, Celia?
Khalid, do you have any questions? Khalid? I think your mic's turned off.
I hope I haven't been condemned by the Mufti of Mecca.
I think Madrid has something to say.
I wanted to go back on something that Pierre-Charles said. You define at one point gambling as a zero-sum game, and yet the explanations as to why some people gamble and the fairness they see in the whole process, particularly, let's say, lotteries where what is behind is, let's say, governments that make use the funds raised for welfare purposes, etc. That surely contradicts the fact that gambling is a zero-sum game, certainly in every case, even in certain circumstances in some cases, but not as a whole. And zero-sum game for whom? Certainly not for perhaps the betting houses, because for them it is not a zero-sum game, it's a big business.
I'm sorry. There was a background noise, and I'm not sure I've get your answer rightly. Your question rightly.
No, I was talking about the fact that you defined gambling as a zero-sum game, and then later on, in answer to the question, was the fact that you said that some people bet or gamble and they see the whole betting scheme as fair, particularly if we are talking about lotteries which are backed up by state money and where monies raised are used for welfare purposes. And my question is therefore whether gambling is in every case a zero-sum game, and if it is a zero-sum game, for whom? Because I doubt whether it is a zero-sum game for the betting houses. At the end of the day, it's big money for them, and if it were a zero-sum game for them, they would be out of business.
Well, I'd be tempted to say that gambling is fair when people are comfortable with the idea that their money is well off by being used by others in the scheme. Okay? And so my point was that with lottery, people who play the lottery are comfortable with the idea that some other might benefit from their own money. And so they are okay with the idea of losing to a cause which is okay for them. In this case, it's not very different from a compensation scheme. I know this is not gambling, in fact. So my temptation is to say that gambling is fair when it's not really gambling. When you agree to paying for a collective task, which might benefit you, but which might benefit others. So basically, it sounds like takaful. You say, because takaful is you pay, you do not expect anything in return. So that's the way gambling seems tolerable for me.
Colleen?
Yes, I can.
We can hear you. We can hear you. Go ahead, ask your questions.
Thank you very much for your presentations. For me, it was really a very, very good time that I have learned a lot from being with you. And you request us in the beginning of the presentation, we were going through slide number 10. And your understanding was that the Quran is advise them to avoid these. Actually, the meaning is avoid is that they have been prohibited, that they are not allowed. So it is not an advice. And thank you very much that you sent the presentation. I was able to go through different tafsir of the Quran this morning, and all of the different tafsirs make it very clear that it is avoid and not an advice. This is number one. Number two, what I got from your economic analysis in different parts, that the conclusion that you reach at the end, that even the economic analysis of the economic analysis itself prove to you that the results, that it will be damaging, that you are actually supporting and helping the money launderers and the crime groups and etc. So, in my opinion, that the result that you reached is actually what we here believe that gambling is something very bad for the economy and very bad because you actually are not buying happiness at all. Maybe if we study very carefully the social impacts of gambling, we will find out that many of the gamblers, they go and hang themselves, or they make some cause of killing themselves. So actually, there is no that happiness that we are talking about. We are missing 8 slides of your presentation, starting from slide 17 to 25. This part, unfortunately, I was not able to follow up when you were making your presentation. But finally, I think this is a new ideas that we can go and think about it when it comes to Islamic economics and Islamic finance, and maybe some new findings or some new results can be extracted from it. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Thank you very much, Professor Pierce. With your, it was excellent presentation, and truly appreciate. I have, with your kind permission, Professor Pierce, and in due respect of you, let me humbly contradict your opinion on this matter. As you have claimed that this gambling, according to you, is tolerable. So I have to contradict this particular perception. Now, the grounds here, as we know, that gambling is, I'm going to just highlight here 2 points only, just to reject the perception or the contention of this gambling. And also this, I will give you some submission here. And secondly, the liability insurance, which we have some confusion that I have observed just now. I'll try to come up with a simple solution, inshallah, on this. Now, as we know, that gambling is an opportunity, which gives an opportunity for one person or one party to gain at the expense of others. There is no risk, as just a gain at the expense of others. Now, as we know that once Pope Clement declared that actually gambling and usury both are unethical and against the human these rights and this peace and harmony. Therefore, he advised that this the usury and also this gambling shall be avoided and shall be held null and void, because of it may threaten to the world peace one day. Now, as regard to this gambling, as we know that today we have in the world sports and everywhere, at the international level, at the local level, at the domestic level, we have the gambling in the sports in particular. So now, as you mentioned that the gambling, if aggressively, it is not tolerable. But according to the Judaism, which provides that if moderate is tolerable. So now moderate here, the Judaism perception here, which I would like to clarify that actually probably it's not a gambling, it's a gaming for the entertainment, it's not a gaining, okay? So now if we label this one as a gambling, that is not acceptable. Now, as regard to the natural law, positive law, or equitable principle, in all cases, in all situations, in equitable principles, in no situation that the gambling can be acceptable because of it is an opportunity given to one party to gain at the expense of others, and therefore it is a contradiction to the fundamental principles of economy, that is just a distribution. Therefore, to submit here that gambling in no situation is not religiously speaking from Quranic point of view, of course, definitely is rejected, but from other religion, other theology, other thoughts, philosophy, in no situation gambling can be acceptable from the humanitarian, the benefit as the chapter to be considered. Therefore, again to submit here that the gambling shall not have any acceptable, acceptable status. Again, I have to highlight here that gambling, even though we have concluded and we understand unanimously that gambling is not permissible and it is not beneficial at all, but unfortunately we can observe today in the world that the gamblers are dominating the countries, and the country's law or the world law or world regulations, whereby we can see that even though we claim that the gambling is not beneficial, is not permissible, but the many countries who are considering and then approving this gambling, and then therefore imposing the tax, as Professor Pierce also mentioned, the imposing tax, etc. There's an implied consideration and implied permission. And therefore, as Professor Pierce also mentioned, that how to stop the online gambling and so on. So my humble submission here, or the suggestion here, that this particular online gambling can be stopped by endorsement of the international regulation by the convention. I mean, there's like Geneva Convention, whatever it is. If they pass regulations and the convention, unanimously agreed by the world at large, and then it is not the regulation in paper only, it has to be enforced. Once it is enforced, then there will be an effective results. Now, again, my contention here, that do you think that the countries of the world have to rely on the income or the revenue from the gambling? It is not, definitely not, because of, as you know, that the impact, the gambling is a faculty or the chapter in economy which enforce or which allows or which open a door to gain something at the expense of others, and that is an unfair gain. So now that is my submission. Now last issue here, that the liability insurance, as we have some confusion, I have realized from a few sides actually. The liability insurance is an insurance, is a scheme whereby to allow the insurance company or the insurer to provide the compensation for the third party against the loss or catastrophe or damages. Whereas in a gambling is an opportunity given to one party to gain something at the expense of others. Therefore, a gambling and liability insurance is a totally a different chapter. Thank you very much.
I congratulate Dr. Pierre, very interesting presentation. And in your presentation, you quote one verse from the Quran. I would like to draw your attention to another verse, and just for your meditation. That is, Quran says, people are asking you about wine and gambling. يسألونك عن الخمر والميسر قل فيهما اسم كبير. Tell them that in these two there are a lot of too much sin, ومنافع, and there are benefits also. But ismuhuma akbaru min nafihima. that the its I can say cost or its sin are much more than its benefits. So this we should take into consideration, and not only the we should take as a comprehensive view of while we are analyzing not only this any economic, but also its impact on our spiritual and impact, and also on relations, and what kind of feeling it creates among those who are playing this game. That's all. Thank you very much.
First, we want to thank you for this informative presentation. I have a comment here about fairness of gambling. The gambling is prohibited because it's negative zero game on all levels. If we take on simple gambling where two sit on one table, mathematically is a zero-sum game, but on global level, there is money, there is resources wasted, and the outcome is zero. So here we have a negative. For the organized gambling, there is operator. He have to cut part of the money being dealt with, so it must be a negative zero game. There is many side effect of this organized gambling, which affects the social relations. There is many crime attached, and many vices come with this kind of activity. So, when we evaluate this kind, it cannot be fair because, as I said before, it have a zero, or there is a negative net game on individual level and on the macro level. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for the informative presentation. Regardless of if it's haram or halal or prohibited or not, I have an issue with the mentality of the gambler. Okay, if we look at the wealthy personnel, and in general, usually they have benefited the general people. They have made something. The Rockefeller, Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, they all have contributed to the world. They have made the world a better place. The mentality of the gambler is stripped of this idea because he's buying his dream, or he's following his dream the wrong way. And this is a wasted resource. That's it. Thank you. And also, the money used in the gambling business also can be used in more beneficial ways to the general and to the person himself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your careful reading. First, I should apologize for the missing slides, which were the slides connected to the gambling versus liability insurance. It's an idea I had tonight, and hence I added some slides just to get your opinion about the comparison. But as you say, it's not the right comparison, so I'm forgetting it. Then I think we agree on most things. I'm happy that you say that there is no risk in gambling, because here there is an advocacy of gambling. There are many people saying that gambling is fun, gambling promotes risk-taking, gambling is the first step toward entrepreneurship, etc. I think this is all bullshit, and you made the point very clear, and I'm happy to find people to agree with me and to support this opinion. Then, the argument saying that zero-sum game is not a zero-sum game, but as you add the waste of resource, it's a negative sum game. Fine, I will take it in the book. Thank you very much. Then you made some points where you do disagree, and of course, which I must answer. First, you seem to understand that I'm in favor of gambling. As I told you in the beginning, I'm not in favor of gambling. My point is simply that I'm thinking of the best way, not just to prohibit gambling, but to have the prohibition enforced and steadily enforced. And as the question by Celia made it clear, the problem is that there is a strong tendency, it's not an instinct, but people are tempted to gamble. What can we do with this? You know? In this respect, I think there is a difference between the people who are trying to buy some dream and the people who have a perverse tendency to consume their time, waste their time in a non-productive activity. This is quite different. But maybe you think there is no difference because what is bad in large quantity is bad in small quantity. I've read this somewhere, and this argument can be used here. But I'm not in favor of gambling. What I see is that at some point, moderate gambling can fund the enforcement of prohibition of dangerous gambling. And because my question is, how do you fund enforcement of the prohibition of gambling if you have no revenue for this? Okay, and well, your answer is that it would be enough to have an online World Convention against online gambling. It would be enough, but this is somewhat wishful thinking because we don't have this convention ready, and there are many countries who would not sign it because many countries are benefiting from supplying other countries' nationals with gambling. If we take, for instance, the territory of Cagayan, it's a region in Philippines. They do host online gambling operators, and they forbid them from taking bets from nationals. Basically, it's completely cynical. They forbid them from offering in the country the gambles that they do sell abroad. So they know that they're doing something bad, but they're doing it. Maybe you're right if you think that it will be easy to stop Cagayan, because Cagayan is not a large military power, etc. But at some point, if we curb gambling in Cagayan, in Aruba, in Costa Rica, in all the countries that are offering online gambling, what we are doing is simply that we are providing country who did not invest into that business with the opportunity to do it now. And in the end, we will meet the Brits, and the Brits, they are quite hard about gambling. So if only it were possible to end up gambling with a worldwide agreement, I would sing it. But I'm not sure it will work. So what I'm doing right now is try to advocate the reduction of gambling and asking the question, how do we fund the enforcement of prohibition? Which revenue will we take? Because in most Western countries, people would not be willing to pay a tax to enforce the prohibition of gambling. That's it. So you might think this is the proof or the evidence that the West is corrupt. I think, it's the situation we do have. So what shall we do with it? My answer in the Western context is maybe we could legalize some form of gambling, such as lottery, in order to fund the enforcement of prohibition of more toxic forms of gambling, because we might think of lottery as a gift to an institution which might bring back some benefits, but if we frame it not as a gambling scheme but as a charity scheme, it might be different also from the point of view of education of the public, because it seems then that gambling is not legitimate. What is legitimate is donating to an institution that can bring you back some money, but which is concerned basically with charity business.
Let me have a final new comment, Professor Pierre.
Actually, we know you very well. We don't ever think you are supporting gambling or that you are pro-gambling. This is not really what we have in mind. We have so much respect and acceptance of your ideas. Number two, let me take you back to your slide number 20. And you state clearly that while the Romans were pragmatic, money has no smell, said Titus Valerius Vesbian when he put a tax on urine. So as you show very clearly, those politicians who are pushing for the organization and the legalization are the main cause. When they have no way of actually reducing economic development to the countries or money resources, they go to such schemes. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you for your benevolence and advice.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. See you next month, inshallah.